some artists do not paint to be remembered. They paint because memory on its own is too fragile, because history, left untouched, tends to forget not only names but textures. The feel of light on a shoulder, the breath between a war and a treaty, the silence between two colors on a wall. Jeanne Thil, her name is not shouted in marble, nor chiseled in textbooks. It is whispered in the salt air of Calais, where gulls cry above cliffs and history lingers in the damp breath of the channel. A name carried in the wind, like a pencil, sketch barely fixed on paper, like a memory not yet lost but not yet fully claimed. She did not roar, she revealed, like a curtain drawn quietly, like truth shown through a keyhole. Born in 1887 in a town brushed constantly by the sea, a town where France stretches toward Britain, not to divide, but to reach. Jeanne Thil was not raised to build bridges. She became one, not of stone or steel, but of color, gesture, suggestion. But more than a bridge, she was a mirror, and not the kind that reflects only a face, but the kind that remembers a glance, a history shared between two sides of a narrow sea. While men recited treaties, she painted them. While borders were drawn in ink, she offered pastel skies. And while others sought legacy, she sought layering, the kind of truth that requires shadow to be seen. Picture a girl growing up on the edge of France, not where fountains sing and marble shines, but where wind is the only orchestra and the chalk cliffs crumble slowly like forgotten letters. She lives in a place where the air smells of salt and iron, where even the silence feels like it has weathered something. Here, the sky doesn't sparkle. It presses. It sits low and gray, full of old griefs, full of questions never quite answered. A sky heavy with sea fog and war memories, as if the clouds themselves remember when ships once came, not for trade, but for conquest. And while other painters ran toward the salons of Paris, with their velvet critics and golden frames, Jeanne turned away from the applause. Her eyes were drawn to the delicate seams in time, those fragile diplomatic stitches that once tried to keep France and England from unraveling. Not the explosions of history, but its tremors. Not the heroes, but the hesitations. She painted not the clash, but the moment just before, when someone reaches for peace instead of a sword. Jeanne saw that treaties, like paintings, are layered, fragile under light, easy to tear, but full of meaning if one knows where to look. And so she painted not battles, but peace, not as an ideal, but as a gesture, a brushstroke across a border, a silence louder than gunpowder. Town hall of Le Touquet Paris Plage, there is a wall that breathes, not with lungs, but with memory, a wall that has no voice, yet speaks, a wall not built to divide, but to contain echoes. You don't see it right away, not unless you stand still long enough for time to settle around you like dusk. And on this wall, Jeanne Thil laid down her hands as if touching parchment worn by centuries. She didn't cover the plaster. She unfolded it like a letter long unopened. There she painted not scenes but threads, moments stitched from the fabric of diplomacy, not domination. 1. The wedding of Louis XII and Mary Tudor, 1514. Not a love story, perhaps, but a gesture of grace, a French king and an English princess meeting not under banners of blood, but beneath the trembling promise of peace. 2. The Treaty of Étaples, 1492. A date known more for the New World, but here in France, it was the year two kings chose to write with ink, not iron. When Charles VIII and Henry VII let their pens speak louder than their armies. These were not just murals, they were conversations, between men who rarely listened, between nations often too proud to murmur, between color and silence. Jeanne did not recreate history's noise. She sought its pulse, that subtle throb beneath royal robes, beneath powdered wigs and velvet chairs, where real decisions beat quietly in the background. She gave walls a heartbeat. She painted not what we remember, but what we almost forgot, the soft negotiations, the clasped hands behind closed doors, the glances exchanged across a channel wider than geography. These murals are not decorative. They are delicate memorials to the moments where war was not chosen. And every brushstroke whispers this too was history, and it mattered. In the early 20th century, women were still framed. Not for what they created, but for how they looked when someone else created them. They hung on walls, not as authors, but as ornaments, muses, models, Madonna-like silhouettes posed in oil and stillness. They were seen, yes, but rarely heard in pigment. The fresco was a man's domain, heavy, architectural, public. Too large, they said, too physical, too serious for feminine hands. But Jeanne did not ask if she could. She carried a ladder taller than their doubt, and a silence deeper than their noise. And with every step she rose, not to make a scene, but to paint one. She didn't declare herself a feminist. She didn't brand herself a pioneer. She simply worked, with quiet defiance and an elegance sharper than protest. While salons whispered about whether women belonged on the scaffolding, she stood there, brush in hand, painting diplomacy into stone, layer by layer, like a language being rebuilt. She didn't sign slogans, she signed walls. There were no manifestos in her palette, only convictions in ochre and blue, in pale green and ash gold. Each figure she painted stood not for power, but for the possibility of peace. Each line drawn not for ego, but to outline the space between two hands that choose to meet, not clash. She knew that art, to endure, must do more than provoke. It must listen. And so she painted like someone who knew that some messages don't need to shout because they're already written in the skin of the wall, waiting for someone like her to make them visible. Her art did not shout France, nor whisper England. It spoke in a third voice, the one that arises when two languages learn not to compete, but to breathe together. She didn't choose sides. She chose spaces, the quiet places between flags and frontiers, where memory is not national, but shared. To Jeanne, the channel was never a moat, nor a wound. It was a pause, a breath drawn between two verses, the white silence that gives rhythm to a poem, not absence, but meaning. She painted that silence, not to fill it, but to let it resonate. No banners, no victories, no patriotism disguised as pride. Instead, she gave us gesture, a tilt of the head in a painted figure, a softness in the hands of monarchs long gone. And perhaps that's why her frescoes still speak to those across the water, to viewers from Dublin, from Manchester, from Belfast, who sense, without needing translation, that these walls remember something bigger than borders. Her brush didn't instruct, it invited. She didn't lecture us about history, she let it echo through robes and treaties and the long-gone sigh of queens traded for peace. Her murals tell stories where swords were sheathed, where silence was stronger than gunfire, where sisters were not offered in transaction but in trust. Not brides as property but as bridges, living vows between dynasties woven into velvet and politics and hope. Her art reminds us, sometimes the most radical act in history is to choose not to fight. Today, her name is barely spoken in classrooms. There are no street signs bearing her name, no textbooks with glossy reproductions of her work. Her art survives, but softly. It weathers the years like frescoes drawn in fog, subtle and persistent, clinging to the walls not by force, but by memory's breath. Most visitors pass by, their eyes too busy, their minds tuned to louder histories, wars, revolutions, names that thunder. But if you walk, truly walk, through the quiet halls of Le Touquet's Hôtel de Ville, and you pause, really pause, you'll begin to feel it. Not noise, not drama, just a hush. A sacred hush, as if the plaster remembers her fingertips, as if the pigment remembers her intent, as if every curve in the composition still holds a woman's breath, held steady on a ladder, painting peace onto the skin of a wall. Piano begins to return, delicate like a tide. Jeanne Thil did not conquer museums. She didn't brand herself with manifestos. She didn't sculpt marble egos or chase eternal glory. She caressed memory with color, with restraint, with compassion sharpened into line and form. In the borderlands of France, where language and loyalty were once torn like fabric, she came not to mend the tear, but to embroider the seam. She carved not battles, but bridges. So next time you think of war and kings and treaties, don't only remember the names written in gold. Don't only recall the maps redrawn in blood. Think also of a woman in Calais, quiet, steady, unseen, who saw that sometimes history's greatest gesture is a brushstroke no one noticed at the time, but which now, years later, still refuses to fade. She didn't speak in declarations, she listened in layers, and she taught us that peace, real peace, might begin on a wall no one looks at anymore, painted by someone the world forgot. But the wall remembers, and now, so do we.